The parish council chamber of Flaxborough possessed two features that never failed to impress newcomers: an odour faintly suggestive of boiled cabbage, and an ability to make any subject under discussion seem both interminable and faintly ludicrous. On this particular Tuesday evening, the subject was lampposts, specifically whether the ones along Mill Lane should be replaced, repaired, or left to the ingenuity of nature to collapse in their own time. Councillor Larkins, who had made a small career out of opposing anything that smacked of expenditure, was midway through an oration on the sound moral fibre of thrift when the chamber was plunged into sudden darkness. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then came the scream. It was not, to be fair, an especially convincing scream. It lacked conviction, and one councillor later described it as like someone stepping into a lukewarm bath. Yet it served its purpose, to fill the darkness with a collective shiver. When the overhead lamps spluttered back to life, the assembled members blinked at one another with the affronted air of people whose civic dignity had been momentarily mislaid. Only one figure broke the tableau. Councillor Edith Slattery, a woman whose unbending temper had cowed at least 3 successive chairmen, was found slumped sideways in her chair, clutching her arm. Her spectacles had fallen to the floor, and her lips formed a thin, tight line. "My arm," she gasped, as though resenting the very fact of possessing one. The meeting dissolved into a commotion of officious advice. Councillor Larkins demanded cold water. Councillor Briggs suggested smelling salts, which he claimed to carry habitually. Councillor Spratt, the youngest and most eager of the lot, ran for the caretaker as though he might somehow repair the situation with a mop and bucket. In the end, it was Mrs. Hopley, the council clerk, who restored order with a sharp command that someone fetch Dr. Hilliard. By the time the doctor arrived, bustling and red-eared from his bicycle ride, Edith Slattery's condition had moderated from dramatic collapse to glowering irritability. Her sleeve had been pushed up, revealing an angry bruise around her upper arm. "Well?" she demanded. Dr. Hilliard pursed his lips.
"Not broken. Not sprained. A grip mark, I should say. A grip mark."
Echoed half the council in tones of scandalized disbelief. Yes, someone seized her arm quite forcibly.
Recently, too. The councillors swiveled their gazes upon one another with expressions ranging from wounded innocence to barely suppressed curiosity. "During the blackout, I suppose," muttered Larkins. There was an uncomfortable pause. The blackout had lasted only seconds.
Enough, it seemed, for someone to seize Councillor Slattery's arm, hard enough to leave a mark, and then resume their seat before the lights returned. Mrs. Hopley sniffed.
"It sounds like some kind of horseplay." The word fell into the chamber with a scandalous weight, as if she had accused her colleagues of juggling naked. Slattery herself spoke at last.
Her voice, low but cutting, carried easily. "I know who it was." Her words settled on the councillors like dust, provoking an instant, apprehensive stillness. But she said no more. Instead, with a disdainful jerk of her head, she allowed herself to be escorted from the chamber, leaving the others to a silence more eloquent than all the speeches of thrift that had preceded it. The caretaker, arriving at that moment with his ring of keys jangling, looked about at the pale faces and said simply, "Has someone died then?" No one answered him by the following morning. The blackout in the council chamber had become Flaxborough's principal item of conversation, pushing aside even the more durable subjects of milk prices and the rector's new hat. The incident, travelling along the town's conversational wires, acquired in each retelling a little more gravity, a touch more scandal, and not a few embellishments. At Mrs. Penrith's bakery, the early queue heard that Councillor Slattery had been struck violently upon the head with a blunt instrument, quite possibly a spanner smuggled in by a malcontent. A customer swore she had it from her cousin's husband's brother, who had once delivered coal to the council offices. By the time the bread rolls had been bagged and the buns exchanged for gossip, the spanner had evolved into a revolver which, happily for all concerned, had misfired. Across the market square, Mrs. Cundall at the drapery counter insisted it was a burglary gone wrong, a villain having slipped in under cover of darkness to rifle through the councillor's handbags. She confided to one customer that Councillor Slattery was known to keep a considerable amount of ready cash about her person, since she trusted banks no further than she could throw them. At the station buffet, the matter took on still different hues. There, among mugs of stewed tea, the consensus was that the incident had been neither robbery nor assault, but a scandalous lovers' quarrel. It was said, by whom no one could afterwards establish, that Councillor Slattery had been seen, late one evening, in the company of a gentleman not her brother. The blackout, according to this account, had been seized upon by a jealous rival for a moment of retribution. Dr. Hilliard, finding himself besieged by questions as he made his rounds, confined his remarks to the unassailable statement that her arm was bruised. This was received with scepticism by his more excitable listeners, who maintained that he was withholding the true extent of her injuries out of professional discretion. One wag at the pub that night declared the doctor had probably stitched her back together and didn't want the responsibility of alarming the public. Meanwhile, Edith Slattery herself had taken to her house and refused all callers. This naturally inflamed speculation. Some were certain she was too shaken to face the world. Others interpreted her seclusion as proof that she meant to pursue a case against her assailant with all the force of the law. A few even hinted she was plotting a more private revenge, which, given her formidable temperament, seemed quite plausible. Mrs. Hopley, the council clerk, contributed her own version, careful to suggest that the blackout might have been the result of nothing more sinister than poor wiring. Still, she allowed herself to hint, discreetly, but not too discreetly, that one councillor had been heard fumbling in his pockets just before the lights failed. This, of course, opened fresh avenues of speculation. By mid-afternoon, the town's collective imagination had furnished so many culprits, motives and implements of assault that the original, meagre facts were quite lost beneath a pile of conjecture. Even Councillor Larkins, ordinarily sceptical of everything save his own opinions, began to wonder if some villainous design had indeed been at work. It was into this fog of conjecture that Inspector Purbright stepped, with his customary mild expression and air of polite attentiveness. For the moment, he made no effort to cut through it. Gossip, he had long since discovered, was like smoke, left alone. It might reveal which way the wind truly blew. Inspector Perbrite began his inquiries with the same unhurried calm that had long disconcerted the inhabitants of Flaxborough. His first visit was to the council chamber itself, where the caretaker, Mr. Ragg, was busy polishing brass with the solemnity of a man restoring honour to a tarnished institution. Funny business.
That blackout, Ragg remarked, puffing on his cloth.
Never known the lights to fail before? Well, not all at once, like.
One bulb goes, you expect it.
But the lot? That's deliberate, if you ask me. Perbrite, who never discouraged confidences, nodded gravely. You didn't notice anyone by the switch, I suppose? Switch is in the lobby.
Locked box, only I've got the key. Ragg tapped his bunch of metal with a pride only slightly undercut by the fact that half the town knew he often left them on a nail by the door. Leaving Ragg to his brass,
Perbrite moved on to the councillors themselves. Councillor Larkins, intercepted outside his ironmonger's shop, was eager to suggest that Edith Slattery's injury had been self-inflicted. Wouldn't put it past her, he said, adjusting a display of buckets. Always dramatizing. She's wanted me off the lighting committee for years. Perhaps she thought a swoon might do it. Councillor Briggs, when visited at his neat, terraced house, was more circumspect. I was sitting 2 seats away, Inspector.
Couldn't see a thing, of course. But I did hear, how shall I put it?
A rustle.
As though someone shifted suddenly in their chair. He cleared his throat.
Might have been Mrs. Hopley. She fidgets dreadfully. Mrs. Hopley herself bristled when the suggestion was put to her.
I did no such thing.
The very idea. I was making notes, even in the dark, though whether I could read them afterwards is another matter. She paused, her gaze narrowing. Between ourselves, Inspector, I rather think it was Councillor Spratt. Young men are apt to seize opportunities, aren't they? Spratt, found in the bank where he toiled as a junior clerk, flushed crimson at the insinuation.
I was halfway across the room from Mrs. Slattery.
Why should I lay a hand on her? He hesitated, then muttered, though I dare say she's insulted enough people to make any number of enemies. The thread of contradiction grew firmer when Purbright compared their accounts of seating. Each councillor described the arrangement confidently, but with small, irreconcilable differences. Mrs. Hopley claimed Spratt had occupied the end seat by the door, which Spratt denied, placing himself squarely between Larkins and the absent Councillor Dodds. It was not the sort of inconsistency that proved guilt, but Perbrite filed it away with quiet satisfaction. People could forget a detail, certainly. But when everyone forgot in a different fashion, there was usually more to it than faulty memory. When at last he called at Councillor Slattery's house, he was received with frosty politeness. She stood in her hallway, arm-bandaged, eyes glittering behind fresh spectacles. "You wish me to repeat what I told them all?" she said. "Very well."
Someone grabbed me. I felt the hand.
It was not clumsy, Inspector, nor timid.
A deliberate grip.
"A warning? From whom?" Perbrite asked softly. Slattery's lips thinned further. "I have my suspicions, but I will not gratify certain persons by naming them prematurely."
"Let them stew!" Perbrite inclined his head as though agreement lay in silence.
Outside, as he walked away, he allowed himself a small smile. In Flaxborough, he reflected, one did not need evidence to stir suspicion. A hint would do quite as well, and sometimes even better. By the week's end, the clamour of speculation had begun to congeal into something more solid, if not necessarily more reliable. It was Councillor Briggs who, perhaps unwittingly, gave it direction. Over a pint at the Dog and Whistle, he remarked that Councillor Dodds had been conspicuously absent from the meeting. And absent, he added, with a self-satisfied wag of the finger, at the very moment when he might have wished Mrs. Slattery a little ill. Dodds, a portly man of red face and perpetually damp forehead, was well known for his long-running feud with Edith Slattery over a planning dispute. She had opposed his scheme to convert a disused warehouse into a billiard hall, claiming that it would bring moral decline to the area. He, in turn, had accused her of hypocrisy, given her own brother's well-attested fondness for gin. Their exchanges in council had become a form of entertainment to the public, though neither participant was known to laugh. Thus, when Briggs's remark was repeated and improved upon throughout the town, it seemed only natural that suspicion should settle upon Dodds. He had not only motive, but also, by virtue of his absence, the mysterious opportunity. Whispers transformed this into near certainty. Dodds had somehow slipped into the chamber during the darkness, struck his blow, and vanished again before the lights returned. That no one recalled seeing him anywhere nearby was taken as further proof of guilt, Spectre. Purbright listened to all this with the same expression he might have worn while watching clouds gather over the cricket ground. When he called upon Dodds at his home, the councillor greeted him in a bathrobe, smelling of embrocation. "I was at home that evening."
"Inspector," Dodds declared with the defiant air of a man wrongly accused of poaching.
A touch of lumbago. "Couldn't have got out of my chair, let alone crept about council chambers. My wife will tell you." Mrs. Dodds did, in fact, confirm her husband's indisposition with a brisk nod, though she added that he had not been in the best of tempers that night, having listened to Slattery's speech on the wireless some days earlier. "She'd provoke a saint," she observed tartly. Back in the police station, Sergeant Love reported that several townspeople were demanding Dodds's immediate arrest. "They say it's obvious, sir. And if you ask me, it fits well enough.
Nobody likes the man, and it's usually the unlikable ones as do these things. Purbright leaned back in his chair. I dare say.
But unpopularity, while regrettable, is not in itself criminal. Nor is lumbago. Love looked unconvinced. Well, if not him, who else? That, said Perbrite mildly, is what we are to discover. In the meantime, let us resist the comfort of the obvious. It so often proves a very uncomfortable bedfellow. Yet despite his caution, the tide of opinion continued to run against Dodds. Neighbours whispered of his temper, his muttered threats, his shifty look. One particularly enthusiastic rumour placed him at the railway station during the very moment of the blackout, buying a ticket he never used, a detail that, when traced, proved to have originated with a porter who had seen no such thing. For Purbright, the most telling detail was Dodds's reaction itself. A guilty man, he reflected, would have seized the chance to explain away the suspicion, to offer some elaborate alibi. Dodds instead seemed content merely to bluster. It might have been foolishness.
It might have been innocence.
But it did not have the tidy neatness of guilt. It was on the following morning, while the council chamber was being readied for another meeting, that Inspector Purbright noticed the umbrella. It leaned inconspicuously against the far wall, half concealed by a stack of folding chairs. There was nothing remarkable about umbrellas in general. Flaxborough was full of them, most of them black, most of them with a tendency to drip in all the wrong places. This one, however, bore a tag stitched inside the fabric with initials J.W., neatly worked in blue thread. Perbrite lifted it carefully, turning it in his hands. The ferrule was slightly bent, as though it had been pressed into service for some unintended purpose. When he asked Mr. Ragg, the caretaker, whose it might be, the man shrugged with the vast indifference of one who had seen councils come and go and leave behind nothing but litter. I don't know.
None of them carried an umbrella that night.
Weather was fair. The detail lodged itself gently in Purbright's mind. In itself, an umbrella was nothing. Yet, in a town where every councillor was known, their habits memorized by neighbours, an unclaimed object took on the faint sheen of mystery. He asked quietly, in the days that followed, whether anyone had missed such an item. Larkins disclaimed ownership at once, declaring he preferred the economy of a waxed coat. Briggs said he never carried one at all, being a man of robust constitution. Mrs. Hopley was affronted at the idea she might lug about anything so cumbersome, and Spratt, confronted with the initials, said they meant nothing to him. "My people are Spratts," he insisted, "and there's not a J among us." The mystery might have faded into the comfortable clutter of forgotten objects had Perbrite not observed one small thing. When he placed the umbrella on the table during his conversation with Councillor Dodds, the man's eyes flickered to it with a speed almost imperceptible, then darted away again as if scorched. He said nothing, however, and the moment passed. Perbrite, as always, betrayed no sign of interest. Instead, he folded the umbrella neatly, returned it to its place, and allowed the councillor to bluster about his lumbago. But the detail remained with him, a thread to be tugged at later. Flaxborough, he reflected, had an extraordinary talent for smothering significance beneath layers of triviality. A bent umbrella, initials unclaimed, an odd glance, all so small, so unworthy of excitement. Yet it was often the small things that refused to be forgotten, and in refusing, revealed what larger matters others were striving to conceal. The umbrella, for the moment, remained in Purbright's mind like an unanswered riddle, but the business of inquiry required him to wander further afield, into the minor byways of Flaxborough life, where motives often grew like weeds in neglected corners. He began with Miss Dabb, the librarian who had attended the council meeting as a representative of the Friends of the Municipal Reading Room. A tall, angular woman with an unshakable belief in the moral improvement of fiction. She had watched proceedings from the public gallery. "It was a disgrace," she told Perbrite crisply, adjusting her pince-nez. The blackout, I mean. Quite unworthy of a civilized town.
And then this assault or whatever it was.
All very melodramatic. I've always said Councillor Slattery encourages it by her manner.
One cannot go about taunting people indefinitely. Miss Dabb, though severe, was not unfriendly.
She went on to relate, with relish, how more than one councillor had crossed swords with Slattery over the years, particularly Briggs. He once proposed reducing the library budget.
I assure you, Inspector, she left him in ribbons.
Figuratively, of course. From the library, Purbright wandered to the vestry where he found Mr. Harby, the organist, cleaning the pedals of his instrument with a rag that looked older than the organ itself. Harby had also been present at the meeting, in his capacity as a concerned parishioner. He shook his head gloomily.
It's the electrics, you see.
I've been saying so for years. Wires worn thin, fuses patched. Surprised no one's been electrocuted. It was at the iron foundry that Perbrite encountered a rather more pointed grudge. Mr. Clegg, foreman, recalled that Slattery had objected strongly to his application for an extension to the works, said the smoke was a menace to housewives' washing, got the council to vote it down.
I've no time for her, Inspector.
But if anyone laid hands on her, it wasn't me.
I've better things to do with my evenings. He spat into the dust to underline the point. Not all resentments were industrial. Mrs. Price, a seamstress who often stitched for the town's better families,
was discovered in her shop with pins bristling from her sleeve. She confided to Purbright that Slattery had once humiliated her publicly by returning a dress and declaring it an insult to my dignity. Mrs. Price's cheeks coloured at the memory. If she were to vanish tomorrow, Inspector, I wouldn't shed a tear. Still, I don't go about grabbing people in the dark.
I've work enough to do in daylight. These voices, each with its own little sting,
Added up to a picture less of one dramatic enmity than of a dozen small ones, any of which might have flared briefly in that short, convenient darkness. To Perbrite, it was precisely this accumulation of minor grievances that gave the affair its curious texture. No single motive was grand, but each was perfectly sufficient in the petty theatre of Flaxborough. Sergeant Love, listening to his superior's notes with mounting exasperation.
Asked about, but what do we do, sir, with all these little grudges?
They can't all have gone for her at once. Perbrite looked at him mildly. No, but the curious thing about grudges, Sergeant, is that they rarely fade. They merely wait for their chance.
And the dark, he added, almost to himself,
is a very obliging accomplice. The second disturbance came sooner than anyone might have expected, and in a manner that seemed, to Perbrite at least, almost perversely deliberate. 2 evenings after his patient trudge among witnesses and grudges, the police station telephone rang with a summons from Mrs. Crowe, landlady of the Stag's Head public house. Her voice, shrill with indignation rather than alarm, announced that another councillor had been subjected to a very low trick, Inspector, and under my roof too, which I'll not have. When Perbrite arrived, accompanied by Love, he was shown into the lounge bar where Councillor Briggs sat nursing a forehead already swelling into a respectable egg. The councillor's wife, a woman whose calm was more of ice than composure, hovered beside him as though eager to ensure the injury did not excuse him from her scrutiny. Someone, Mrs. Crowe declared, tipped a jug of ale over the lights.
Out they went, and before you could draw breath there was scuffling, a cry, and poor Councillor Briggs here had been clouted from behind. I ask you, Inspector, what kind of behaviour is this in a reputable house?
Briggs, rubbing his head with a sort of baffled dignity, muttered that he had no notion who the coward might be. He insisted, however, that it was connected with the affair at the council meeting. Same hand, you mark me, Perbrite. Whoever laid into Slattery is now after me. Likely a malcontent opposed to civic order.
An anarchist, no less. His wife sniffed, plainly unconvinced that her husband's importance warranted anarchists. Love busied himself with torch and notepad, questioning patrons who had been present.
Most claimed to have seen nothing. A few volunteered that the sudden blackness had produced such a confusion of elbows and spilled drinks that any number of bumps might be accounted for without malice. Yet one elderly fellow, a retired railway guard, maintained that he had glimpsed a figure slipping out through the side door before the lights returned. Quick as smoke he was, the man said. Though pressed for detail, he could only add that the stranger had worn a coat too big for him. The odd echo of the first incident could not be ignored. Darkness contrived. A blow delivered, the victim left startled but hardly incapacitated. To Purbright, this repetition suggested less a crime of passion than a performance, something staged with deliberate flourish. He sat quietly while Briggs blustered, letting the counsellor's complaints roll past him like distant thunder. What interested him more was Mrs. Crow's observation that the jug of ale
responsible for dousing the lamps had been
fetched only minutes earlier by a young man no one seemed able to name when they stepped back into the night.
Love gave voice to the unease both felt. It's almost as if the fellow's practicing, sir.
Getting his hand in, so to speak, Perbrite, staring thoughtfully down the darkened street, nodded. Yes, Sergeant. And practice implies rehearsal for something larger. The question is, does our assailant know his part well enough yet, or is he still testing the scenery? Inspector Purbright's office, though serviceable,
had never quite rid itself of a faintly ecclesiastical air,
as though the room were designed less for the unravelling of human mischief than for the gentle admonition of choir boys. That evening, with Sergeant Love dispatched to make inquiries about the elusive youth in the ill-fitting coat, Perbrite remained alone at his desk, not writing, but gazing upon the pale circle of lamplight where his blotter lay. It was not, he reflected, the violence that troubled him. The two attacks, if one could honour them with so vigorous a word, had been curiously restrained, more like gestures than attempts at serious harm. In a town such as Flaxborough, where the most grievous offence of an ordinary week was apt to involve a poached rabbit or a window smashed after closing time, the sheer theatricality of these incidents struck him as the most significant feature. Someone wished to make a display, and in making it, wished also to humiliate particular figures of local authority. Briggs and Slattery, he thought, were not men who inspired affection. Slattery's grandiloquence at the council chamber was little more than an irritant, while Briggs's habit of pronouncing upon matters of taste and thrift had long been a standing joke at the Stag's Head. Yet it seemed unlikely that such petty pomposity should drive any soul to nocturnal ambush. The calculation was too neat, the symbolism too pointed. Darkness, a sudden blow, a vanishing figure, a pattern composed as if to be repeated until its meaning forced itself upon the town. Perbrite leaned back, interlacing his fingers and regarding the dusty files upon his shelves. He thought of how men and women, so devoted to the surface niceties of civic life, often disguised beneath them a kind of hunger for recognition, for revenge, even for a modest form of immortality in gossip. An assault, however trivial, upon two councillors could already be counted upon to furnish material for weeks of speculation in the grocer's queue. Perhaps, then, the assailant was less enemy than impresario, one who desired an audience more than a victim. Still, there lingered the curious matter of the detail Mrs. Crow had supplied, the jug of ale fetched by the unidentifiable youth. Perbrite considered how very little it took to render a crowd blind and helpless. A trick of timing, a splash in the right place, and authority was made ridiculous before its constituents. Yes, there was wit here, but of a kind that might turn easily to cruelty once the humour had worn thin. The inspector allowed himself a slow smile. The guilty party, whoever he might be, was likely congratulating himself upon the neatness of his handiwork. Such self-regard, Perbrite knew, was seldom proof against temptation. He would act again, and when he did, the little mask of playfulness might slip just enough to reveal the human pettiness beneath. It was always the human part, not the ingenious contrivance, that yielded the truth. He switched off the lamp, leaving the office in shadow and prepared to leave for home. Behind him, the empty chairs and shelves seemed to listen, as though the very room had become complicit in his patience. The following morning, Purbright arrived at the police station earlier than usual, his expression betraying neither haste nor indolence, but something of a quiet readiness. He had, during his evening reflections, determined that the time had come to prod the unseen hand behind the recent disturbances, not forcefully, but with the kind of gentle insistence that reveals character more surely than interrogation. His first step was to pay a call upon Councillor Briggs, ostensibly to inquire after the man's recovery. The visit was courteous, the inspector declining tea, but listening attentively as Briggs rehearsed his grievances in the full pomp of a man wronged. Perbrite allowed him to complain, only once interjecting with a mild remark. "I wonder, Councillor, whether your assailant might have found himself disappointed.
After all, the blow, though uncomfortable, did you little damage."
Might he not be feeling that his performance lacked an adequate effect? Briggs blinked at him, the notion of having served as part of someone else's stage play clearly affronting him. He responded with renewed bluster, affirming that the Later, in the High Street, the inspector contrived a similar exchange with Councillor Slattery, this time in the hearing of a small knot of townsfolk outside the Drapers. After commiserating with the councillor's lingering discomfort, Purbright observed with studied casualness, "It does make one wonder whether such assaults are directed less at the persons concerned than at the dignity of office itself." He said it mildly, as though thinking aloud, then let the silence do its work. Slattery swelled with indignation, promptly asserting his own unshakable dignity and importance. The listeners tittered discreetly, and Perbrite noted the faintest, beady flicker of satisfaction in the eyes of a thin young man lingering at the edge of the group. The inspector made no move to identify the youth at that moment. Instead, he allowed his comment to ripple through the town in its natural fashion, feeding on gossip and exaggeration until everyone seemed to have heard that Purbright suspected the assaults were mere theatrics. The effect was both subtle and deliberate. The true culprit, if sufficiently vain, would be piqued into proving otherwise. That evening, Purbright attended a Rotary Club dinner where several councillors were present. He had no official reason to be there, yet his attendance seemed to others both courteous and appropriate. During the after-dinner conversation, he allowed himself a small, deliberate observation. "One cannot help but be struck," he said gently, "by the ingenuity of our mischief-maker. Yet ingenuity, I've often found, is rather like yeast in a loaf, apt to puff itself up until it collapses." The remark, delivered with a benign smile, set off a flutter of amusement, though a few faces stiffened at the implication. Perbrite, watching closely, noted which expressions betrayed irritation rather than laughter. Most telling of all was that of the same thin young man now present as a guest of one of the club members. His lips pressed tightly together, his gaze darted, and for a moment the boy looked as though he had swallowed something bitter. The inspector sipped his port without comment. The test had worked, not in exposing guilt outright, but in drawing a reaction where others had merely shrugged. It was, Perbrite knew, the first clear tremor beneath the carefully raked surface of civic respectability. The council chamber was once again occupied, though on this occasion not by the full assembly, but by a select gathering. Councillors Briggs and Slattery, the mayor, Mrs. Crow, summoned with reluctance but considerable curiosity, and the thin young man whom Perbrite had asked, in tones of mild formality, to attend. Sergeant Love stood discreetly to one side, notebook closed, eyes alert. Perbrite opened the proceedings without preamble. His voice was calm, courteous, yet held an unmistakable firmness. "You will forgive me, ladies and gentlemen, for convening you in this way. The matter before us, though it has caused more commotion in rumour than in fact, deserves an end. We have had, as you know, 2 assaults, minor in consequence but significant in design. Councillors Slattery and Briggs have borne the brunt, though I would suggest they were not so much targets as actors unwillingly cast," Briggs harumphed, while Slattery adjusted his tie with wounded dignity. Purbright continued smoothly. "The purpose, I believe, was less injury than humiliation, to reduce our civic figures to objects of amusement. The method, darkness, a sudden blow, a vanishing figure, was not improvised but planned, repeated and calculated to excite gossip." He paused, allowing his words to settle before shifting his gaze toward the youth who sat hunched, as though seeking to fold himself into the chair. And gossip, as we know, is a hungry audience. It was to them, not to his victims, that the perpetrator truly played. Our culprit wished to be admired for daring, to be whispered about, to prove himself cleverer than those he mocked. The mayor, frowning, looked from Perbrite to the youth. "You mean this boy?" Perbrite inclined his head without raising his voice. "Mr. Alfred Preece, apprentice at the ironmonger's. He is not unknown in the town for a taste in amateur dramatics and pranks, though few suspected his appetite for more elaborate mischief." The boy flushed, muttered something inaudible, then raised his chin with defiance. "I only wanted to show them up," he said. "They strut about, telling us how to live, what paint we can use, what we can't hang in our windows. I gave people something to laugh at. What's wrong in that?" Perbrite regarded him with grave kindness. "Nothing, perhaps, if one confines oneself to parody upon the stage, but when one engineers confusion in a crowded room, or contrives the darkening of a public house, one risks harm far greater than a bruised forehead. The same flourish that draws applause can, in different company, cause panic or worse." There was a silence, broken at last by Mrs. Crow's tart voice. "I said from the beginning it was a disgrace to have such antics in a respectable house. Now you see." Briggs swelled, demanding prosecution. Slattery, by contrast, seemed more troubled by the suggestion that his dignity had been employed as raw material for theatre. The mayor, after a moment's deliberation, inclined toward a lenient course, mindful of both the lad's youth and the public appetite for a moral conclusion without scandal. Purbright closed the matter with characteristic restraint. The law can, of course, be applied, yet it is often as effective in such cases to let the town itself pass judgment. Mr. Preece's reputation will now keep him busier than any magistrate. The boy sank lower in his chair, suddenly comprehending the weight of gossip turned against him. Purbright folded his notes, which had in fact contained nothing at all, and offered a polite nod. The performance, at last, was over. In the days that followed, the town resumed its slow, familiar rhythm, though with the faintest ripple of satisfaction that comes when a mystery has been settled and made safe for retelling. At the grocer's counter, Mrs. Pedge declared that she had suspected young Alfred Preece from the beginning, though her earlier opinions had named 3 entirely different culprits. The ironmonger, embarrassed but pragmatic, remarked that while Alfred had proved unreliable as an apprentice, he had displayed initiative of a sort which in another line of trade might be of value. Councillor Briggs, still nursing his bruised forehead with an attention disproportionate to the fading mark, took to recounting the incident as if he had been the victim of a political conspiracy. Councillor Slattery, by contrast, avoided the subject whenever possible, preferring to shift conversation to his latest scheme for municipal flower beds. Neither man seemed aware that their standing in the town had suffered not from the assaults themselves, but from the manner in which they had responded to them. As for Alfred, He had become a figure of interest to precisely the wrong audience. Where once he had been invisible, he was now the subject of every speculative glance. The laughter he had sought now followed him in whispers, crueler for being subdued. He had staged his play, but the town had written its own ending, and he found himself cast in a part less flattering than he had imagined. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, made no parade of his small success. He wrote a modest report, filed it with care, and returned to the steady trickle of routine matters: a missing bicycle, a complaint of hens trespassing in a neighbor's garden, a motorist disputing a fine. Yet he carried with him, as he so often did, a quiet observation: that the craving for notice, once stirred, seldom rested. Respectability, however zealously defended, was ever vulnerable to the need for applause. One evening, as he walked home, past the gas lamps just being lit, Perbrite allowed himself a faint smile. The town, in its way, was content again, though perhaps a shade more wary of shadows. Tomorrow there would be fresh grievances, new gossip, small quarrels dressed in the solemn robes of importance. He would listen to them all with the same patience, knowing that beneath their comedy lay the same persistent truths of human vanity and pride. He reached his house, hung up his hat, and sat at his desk with the quiet relief of paperwork waiting.